So first of all, I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity of presenting my recent research realized here at Cergy, but also a continuation of my former research at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, which is a very good Orientalist university, very traditional, with a great library for Oriental studies. So this a bit a continuation, but I'm very glad to be able to develop also some of the Francophone aspects of my project during this residency at CE Advanced Studies. And I'm also glad to bring into discussion here in France the topic of Islamic legacies that are increasingly present as a part of intellectual history, not only in the obviously Islamic areas such as North Africa or the Middle East, but also in Europe. It is a topic that is often associated with a degree of anxiety. So I choose to begin my presentation with a satirical novel that actually tries to disarm this fear with laughter, or at least black humor. At the same time, this example will permit me to present a working definition of Euro-Mediterranean literature and to sketch, at least in the great lines, what kind of Islamic legacies are present in it, where do they actually come from, and what is their function. Let's start by my favorite example, L'Insoumise de la Porte de Flandre. So, it is a novel published by Fouad Laroui in 2017, quite recently. Fouad Laroui, the nephew of a great Maghrebian intellectual of the former generation, the historian Abdallah Laroui. It's just to mention, but I will speak later on of the continuity of Euro-Mediterranean culture that is not exactly a recent or a contemporary phenomenon. I will return to this, but let's say a few words about the satirical plot. The novel features Fati, a sort of paradigmatic female figure of today's Europe, a gifted student of Arab origin at the University of Brussels, who nonetheless hides a rather surprising secret. She keeps up her financial balance as a striptease worker. So every day she leaves her Islamic ghetto of Molenbeek, wearing the niqab, traditional black robes, and she goes to an apartment in the downtown, which she hires with yet another colleague, to change herself. And when she goes to the club where she works, to undress herself for her clients. Meanwhile, her transformation is discovered by her would-be Arab husband, Fawzi, who starts to follow her. At this persecution, it is in turn discovered by a journalist detective who takes an interest in this amazing story of what he calls les corbeaux du corbeau, the beautiful body of a black Islamic raven. According to the stereotype concerning men of his ethnicity, Fawzi soon has an access of his typical Arabian crazes. He grasps the biggest cleaver in the halal butcher shop of his brother and starts to run with it across the streets of Brussels, chopping on his way a mannequin presenting an elegant crimson bra. As he arrives at the erotic clubs, he also chops the obese owner of the establishment, the big pig that is this owner. To complete the grotesque depiction of a massacre, here the black humor of Fouad Laroui is in his blossom. Also, Fawzi is shot dead by the police, and the bloody body remains in the street for several hours because the police supposes that Fawzi is a suicidal terrorist with plenty of explosives attached to his body. No one presumes that the reason of his attack might be strictly private, and that it might be just an affair concerning a striptease girl. Because in the current narration about the Arabs and Islam, this current narration doesn't presuppose such a sequence of events. So Fati is not associated with the murder, and she quietly goes on to assist to yet another conference given by the intellectuals discussing Islam. Here the reader who possesses the sufficient knowledge and also a sufficient amount of sense of humor may discover yet another level of significance in the satirical plot. The main figure that is satirically portrayed is Tariq Ramadan, the specialist on duty in all Islamic matters, whatever comes to the discussion. And he distinguishes himself mainly by the quality of his suits designed by Armani. I have no time to enter in all the details here, but Laroui gives in this novel quite a pertinent analysis of this peculiar stage on which various figures pretending to the status of Islamic intellectual actually appear one by one in the limelight. In the end, it is perhaps Rashid Benzine who receives the least dose of criticism. For those who do not follow such topics, Benzine is a bit younger generation. He's my age, but younger than Tariq Ramadan. He is famous mainly for his peculiar reading of the Quran, that he presents as historical and critical. To be sure, he is also a new star to replace the old star, regularly invited to Brussels and receiving important subventions, for instance, to make some capsule video to explain the Quran to the young people under official state sponsorship. Be that as it may, it is the authenticity of Fati's spiritual quest that is burning bright against the context of his generously sponsored wise men who in reality know or understand very little, at least in the vision of Fouad Laroui. It is significant that Fati's situation is expressed in a Christian, not an Islamic parable, that of the Christ among the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, depicted by a 17th century painter, Philippe de Champagne. It is not misplaced to remember that also the Christ lived among the marginalized, and he had a prostitute, Mary Magdalene, among his followers and companions. In fact, the Christianity gives a perennial lesson of spiritual values that are to be found at the very bottom of human misery. So Fati, striptease worker, is a bit entering this paradigm in this essential vision that goes really down to life of Jesus Christ. Fati becomes a striptease worker because she rebels against the gender constraints imposed upon her as a young female. She wears her niqab against Europe and its omnipresent imaginary of female nakedness, present not only in the statues adorning the parks, but even in the miniature depictions of Lady Godiva, printed on every single box of Belgian chocolates. As a striptease girl, Fati not only uses her nudity against her culture of origin, but also brings into the limelight the double invisibility of female face, covered by this Islamic veil, but also by the erotic mask she wears while presenting quite a different part of her body to her clients. Because in both variants of the patriarchal culture, the European and the Mediterranean one, the female is still an object of, so to speak, an anti-Levinasian encounter. Not that of the face, but that of a buttock or sex organs. Just to give a brief reminder for those who are not particularly familiar with philosophy, Emmanuel Levinas said that the other's face is a sign of the divine. A face-to-face encounter is an epiphany. Instead of this, Fouad Laroui constantly reminds us that we live in a culture of profane face-to-buttock encounters, in which epiphanies are lacking. Yet in a parallel reading, what comes to my mind is that, at least in the unofficial history of Islamic mysticism, alternative in relation to the dominant orthodox religious views, Several centuries before Levinas, one may also find the idea that the contemplation of a perfect human body created in the image of God may have an epiphanic value. By the way, the main reason why in the Islamic tradition both female and male body should be covered by rather abundant clothing is its essential resemblance with God, not its uncleanness or ugliness. In the classical period of Islamic civilization, where it was usually the body of beautiful young boy, that some people, of course, this is a very minoritarian, transgressive practice, but some people tried to contemplate in order to build some kind of bridge between human physical desire and the mystical ishq, the ardent love of the divine, this divine paradigm which is reflected in the human form, in the human body. So I see no essential theological reason why the body of Fati shouldn't take place of this young boy of tradition to lead to this kind of epiphanic events. In order to legitimize her transgression, Fati returns, among other instances, because the novel is quite rich in allusions, in various notions she brings about. So among other instances, she returns to the figure of Rābiʿa al-ʿAdawiyya, an 8th century female Sufi mystic, to whom the tradition attributes, the tradition because we do not know very much historically about Rābiʿa. We know her ideas, some of her poems, because it was included in Al-Ghazali's work, so we don't have really the real historical Rābiʿa al-ʿAdawiyya. We have just this indirect knowledge of her. So the tradition attributes to her the endeavour of questioning the validity of gender identities and rigid automatized behaviours derived from female-male identifications. So one of the steps on the mystical path is thus not only the passage from human to divine love, but also the nullification of gender identities, becoming the earthly secular reality. In fact, Laroui's novel doesn't provide any complete, developed interpretation of this rather enigmatic figure. It is rather an allusion, a path for further exploration, which is suggested to the reader. Rābiʿa al-ʿAdawiyya appears just as one of the references in Fati's musings. And she muses essentially on the Islam that might exist beyond the teachings of local imams that evoke the hell much more frequently than possibilities of spiritual development in a positive sense. It is a situation that Fati compares with the history of European Christianity, thinking about the women of the Low Countries that only a generation ago were similarly terrorized with the visions of the hell by the local Christian, Catholic, or Protestant clergy. The young woman wants a religion emancipated from this terror and from this kind of manipulation. At the same time, she realizes that the legacy of her religion is richer, more complex, more profound than it might seem, and she decides to explore it beyond the limitations imposed upon her, not only by those local imams, but also by those Islamic intellectuals she can see at the university guest lectures and on the television. Symbolically, at the end of the novel, she quits the Islamic ghetto of Molenbeek, returning the keys of a flat rented by her family after the death of her Moroccan father. She chooses an individual path of spiritual quest in an intimate contact with the religious heritage that appears at a given moment as transdenominational. yet it just the same remains Islamic. And it signifies that she's not really alone. She remains in the company of the dead. All those Sufi masters and mistresses from the past that can still foster her insight by something which is technically called Uwaisi transmission. For those who are not familiar with this term, it's just enough to think about Star Wars. When we see Obi-Wan Kenobi after his death, when he appears to Luke Skywalker and gives him some hints or leads him on his path. So this is the kind of the belief that in spite of death, in spite of time and space, there is a possibility of some kind of spiritual communication, even with dead figures. Even those dead many centuries ago. So there is this kind of presence that prevents anyone from being actually alone on this path, but on the other hand is very individualistic. Laroui's novel serves me as a perfect exemplification of what the contemporary Euro-Mediterranean literature actually is. Essentially, it is a complex multilingual body of writings created at the crossroad of diverse North African and Middle Eastern origins and European modernity. It is not just migrant writing associated to a social group and its specific problems. It is much more encompassing endeavor, engaging a profound and multidirectional criticism of the modernity, its paradigms as its typical instances, such as the figure of the intellectual as the incarnation of specialized knowledge, problem-solving capacity, and as Edward Said defined it, the mastery of language, mastery in rhetorical and discursive terms. As I said, Euro-Mediterranean literature is not defined by language. It cannot be identified, for instance, with Francophone writing. There is a Euro-Mediterranean literature written in Arabic or in Turkish, as well as in a variety of major and minor European languages. Just to give an example, Najat el-Hashmi is a major representative of his writing in Catalan. On the other hand, Juan Goytisolo is a Spanish-speaking writer from Barcelona who decided to move to Marrakesh to write novels that present at the same time a corrosive vision of European modernity and testify of Islamic mystical inspiration, just as I might quote La reivindicación del conde Don Julián or Las virtudes del pájaro solitario. Euro-Mediterranean literature requires a specific denomination and also a specific analytical treatment, because it cannot be reduced to the traditional fields of national literatures, as well as literatures defined by a given linguistic expression. It exists in parallel to such realities as a literature that is eminently transnational and also eminently translatable. It lives a lot in translation. It travels from one country to another, from one context to another. I think perhaps the Turkish example, I don't know if there's someone who can criticize or agree with this opinion here, but I think the Turkish example shows most clearly how the sphere of Euro-Mediterranean writing coexists with much more traditional and locatable literary space. Obviously, there still exists a Turkish literature defined by its national dimension, the identitary significance it has for a given community. It is defined by the continuity of traditional forms, repertory of images, topics. It is in this literature, poetry is a major form in which this continuity, as well as the celebration of the Turkish language, finds a fulfillment. But in parallel, there exists a Euro-Mediterranean literature in Turkish perhaps Orhan Pamuk is the most obvious example here, in which the major form is the novel, a foreign genre that becomes a vehicle for quite different interrogations, imaginary and topics that have more to do with the rupture introduced by the modernity than with the continuity of Turkish tradition. Characteristically, this Euro-Mediterranean literature represented, for example, by Orhan Pamuk, is far more translatable, has a greater international projection, but quite surprisingly, a lesser status in Turkey itself. Of course, both spheres are mutually not non-exclusive, and they may enter into a synergistic development. Okay, so as I already suggested, what defines the Euro-Mediterranean writing is a specific field of ideas and critical interrogations that result from the encounter or clash of the cultural systems based on tradition, represented by the Islamic southern coast of the Mediterranean, and the great rupture introduced by European modernity. It is on purpose that I avoid speaking about the clash of East and West, and I choose to accentuate rather this north-south geography that has less conflictive connotations. On the other hand, the Mediterranean set of coordinates is something different and alternative in relation to the Euro-Atlantic positioning of Europe inside the traditional concept of the West, that I personally I consider obsolete and in general not serving well the European cause at the present day. So the common denominator that consists in the criticism of modernity is the reason why this literature is so transnational, translocal, and also in many dimensions translingual. It means it engages into a fight against linguistic frontiers, terminologies, translatability of discourses. What is very important to say is that the phenomenon is essentially bidirectional. It implies not only the questioning of Islamic cultures and societies in confrontation with the modernity, but also the other way around, the questioning of modern societies in confrontation with a challenge coming from the South, that in some of my former writings I used to call the intrusive spirit of the desert, and they are attached to this expression. One of the characteristics is that it brings back into the debate the religious factor, the problem of transcendence that secularized modernity was believed to have solved and closed. Friedrich Nietzsche had announced the death of God. Meanwhile, God is coming back from the desert, a symbolic location that shapes, first of all, the European mind. Since Augustine is a kind of Christian symbology of the desert that is still present and acquires a new connotation and a new dimension with this advent of a new reality. Another thing that is very important to say is that the Euro-Mediterranean culture is not new. We might be under the impression that it's a novel reality that came into existence with post-colonial migrations, essentially after the Second World War. But in my view, it is not exactly so. It is a transhistorical processes, a transhistorical phenomenon which is going on, which is gaining density throughout centuries. So, in fact, there are very important pre-modern roots. Nonetheless, this pre-modern Euro-Mediterranean was created, this is why I use this metaphor of density. It was created to a large degree by isolated individuals, often at odds with hegemonic instances of their own culture, maverick thinkers, renegades, marginals. As I speak of transdenominational mysticism, the name of a Catalan thinker, Ramon Llull, comes immediately into the mind as very early precursor of this kind of thinking. But there are also less known figures with fascinating biographies, such as Anselm Turmeda, also called Abdallah al-Tarjuman, the translator, a Franciscan converted to Islam, who lived at the brink of 14th and 15th century, writing both in Catalan and in Arabic. Later on, already in the 16th century, we have such figures as Guillaume Postel, author of the first Arabic grammar in the Renaissance Europe, but also a visionary thinker, thinking about some sort of unification of the Mediterranean. So it is, I do not have time to develop this idea, but this idea of unicity, of unification of the Mediterranean area across this division of religions is a late medieval idea. So it is a recurrent topic that is coming to our times from very, very far in history. Be that as it may, already at the end of the Middle Ages, what I call the Euro-Mediterranean cultural area had sufficient consistency to grant a large degree of translatability, especially at the level of philosophical and theological concepts between Christian and Islamic wars. Just to give an example, it could have such a phenomenon. It also, it's mind-boggling for me. But you could have a late medieval translation of theological treatises in which the quotations from Quran were replaced by the quotations of the Bible. But the main argumentation in theological terms, or the discourse about God, remained the same. So it's quite characteristic of 14th, 15th century. A majority of Islamic thinkers, not only the major ones like Ibn Rushd, but relatively minor like Ibn Bajjah, had the honor of appearing under Latinized names such as Averroes or Avempace, in the great sum of philosophical and theological knowledge of the Latin Middle Ages. Nonetheless, this knowledge coexisted with an immense extent of ignorance concerning Islamic usages and beliefs, especially in northern parts of Europe, because there's a very specific geography of the Mediterranean was names I quoted were from not only from Catalonia but also from islands on the Mediterranean, or islands like Majorca, like Sicily. It was this word of transition, this borderland, that played a great role. But of course, the great encounter between the Northern Europe was the Crusades, that only partially served as a kind of epistemological revolution, but it also had this dimension. So, okay, these are the pre-modern roots. Yes, yet as I said, the crucial element of the emergence of this Euro-Mediterranean area as we know it today is the advent of modernity. The first impulse comes from Europe. It's Europe that invents this modernity, but there are also southern phenomena, such as the Nahda, so-called awakening, or the Arabic Renaissance, that appears as a response to modernity. And there are two kinds of Islamic legacies, or two understandings of Islam, which are very often confronted in the Euro-Mediterranean writings, but are also derived from this modern breakthrough. On the one hand, as it was already suggested by my example, L'insoumise de la Porte de Flandre, there's a great sympathy for mystical Islam or Sufism, which is often treated as a pacifist counterweight to aggressive political understanding of Islam, which is identified with Salafism. Historically speaking, it is not like this. It's an obvious falsification. There's no such thing as a pacifist, outwardly mystical Islam. As far as we speak of Sufism organized into orders with very spiritual leaders, we speak of politically and socially transformative powers, active in history, not immersed in some kind of apolitical, contemplative existence. Such an existence, it's a parenthesis, might eventually be an early literary fiction if we see this tradition through such texts as Ibn Bajjah's Tadbir al-Mutawahid, just I close with parenthesis. Yet historical leaders of Sufi orders had always been men with swords, both in pre-modern and modern history. The best known example, at least here in France, would be for sure Abdelkader, the leader of the fight against the French colonization in the 19th century, who drove a significant part of his influence and mobilizing power from his importance as an Islamic scholar, as a member of the Sufi order Qadiriyya. Even in our times, the transformative power of Sufism in a country like Morocco is epitomized by such figures as Sheikh Yassin. I don't know your opinion about him. It's a very controversial figure, but before the creation of his own Islamic movement, al-Ihsan, he gained his prestige as a member of a Sufi order, Buchichiyya. Whatever one might think about it, such activity contradicts any literary vision of Sufism as apolitical, harmless vision of Islam. So why this sympathy for Sufism? It is also a product of a certain modernity, namely a current of Orientalism, taking its mature shape in the first decades of the 20th century. It was when the figure of Ibn Arabi was, which became not only historically, but also in the imagination, including Western and European imagination, the major figure of mystical Islam. It entered very, very profoundly the European awareness. And it was greatly by chance that the first text translated into a European language was Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, a translator of Passions, a poetical collection presented by Reinhold Nicholson as mystical odes, with this kind of Latinizing, again, generic denomination in 1911. It is really, this early publication contributed to the vision of Ibn Arabi and more generically the mystical Islam as a universal religion of love. It was greatly this vision that attracted the 20th century scholars and converts, such as the Catholic Islamologist Louis Massignon, quite differently connoted, maverick scholars such as Fridtjof Schaun, or the Swiss art historian, a scion of very prominent intellectual family, Titus Burckhardt, who also converted to Islam. Burckhardt became deeply connected to the city of Fez, working together with the UNESCO on its preservation, so on, so on. But it is significant that he still translated in Ibn Arabi, namely Fusus al-Hikam, as well as other Sufi texts, al-Jili, al-Darqawi, etc. In more general terms, mystical Islam found its place and prestige in the so-called perennialist or the traditionalist school, an influential group of scholars that believed in the existence of the so-called perennial philosophy, common to all major world religions. Also, other collective endeavours, such as Bashara School, founded in Scotland in the 60s, in order to foster the teachings of Ibn Arabi, contributed to this popularity and projection that continued very well into the 20th century. But on the other hand, the Salafism may also be treated as a consequence of the modernity that brought a new acute awareness of the historicity of Islam. This is why the advent of the modern fiqh and the Nahda, the Islamic life and Sharia law were no longer perceived as something atemporal, something that existed unchanged in abstract terms. The details of the reality of the first centuries of Islam were no longer vaguely primordial. It started to be solidly anchored in the historical 7th century and became increasingly a crucial point of interrogation, object of studies, questions how people, what people wear, what kind of clothes, how they lived, all the details of the 7th century reality started to gain some sort of solidity as a historical image. And with that came a characteristic, also very modern, melancholy of the beginnings, and the wish to return literally to this Islamic life and usages exactly as they were at the time of the Prophet and his companions, Salaf. It could be said once again that it was, at least to a certain degree, an accident of intellectual history that the paths of Western scholarship, also working on similar topics, became divergent. In Sufism, it was convergent. It was people like Titus Burckhardt actually worked with Islamic scholars and reached very similar conclusions that came very close and established very close links. And in this area of research for the beginnings of Islam, there was so-called revisionist school or critical school of Islamic studies with such scholars as Patricia Crone and working on the early Islam under a rather idiomatic keywords she created of Hagarism. So this kind of discourse became increasingly separated from the discourses and directions of reflections adopted by the scholarship in the Islamic world proper. So just as we had on one hand, we had convergence, and at least at a certain moment, very close collaboration between Western and Islamic scholars on the topics related to Sufism. And there was a divergence as far as the question of the beginnings of Islam was concerned. Although the term Salafism is still under construction, having just as many meanings and possible connotations as Sufism, because it's these times of beginnings where we can put any idea we like, actually. So it is not a very, very clear and very close thing. So it's a term under construction, just as Sufism. But the place both concepts occupy in Western discourses are on the opposite poles. So once I was in a conference in Poland, and I asked my Orientalist colleague, but of what Salafism are you talking? What precisely, what is your definition of the Salafism of which you are talking? And he answered me, Salafism is the worst. To ci najgorsi. So the general definition of a Salafism is the worst Islam. Okay, and the Sufism is the best Islam. So this is more or less the very simplified and very stupid distinction, but nonetheless it works in many contexts, and it's for some people operational, even if they pretend to be professional. So sometimes, of course, these themes of the beginnings of Islam also do appear in the Euro-Mediterranean literature, but they are presented under rather a peculiar light. Just like to give an example, I think very characteristic, is the trilogy of the women of Islam, Les Femmes de l'Islam, the novels Hadija, Fatima, and Aisha, published in 2014-2015 by Marek Halter. I'm pretty sure that it is a kind of rewriting of his story into a her story that is for the benefit of our times, rather than any vision that might be historically plausible. So of course, these novels are eminently anti-Salafist texts. So, but still, there is, of course, it is present and it's still under the discussion. On the other hand, it must be noticed that a lot of the current efforts is aiming at closing this gap and reconciling modern Islam, especially this modern European Islam, with its own awareness of historicity. The name of Rashid Benzine, that has already been cited, may be seen as one of those who work on those early sources, including the Quranic text itself, to give them a new historic dimension that at the same time would fit into our own times. There's a lot of advanced philological research on the Quranic text currently going on, not only in the Islamic world, but also in such places as Leiden University. I was there and was surprised to see these things I imagined people do only in madrasa. But it was there in the European University. So the major sources of Islam are currently under novel scrutiny, and generally the intellectual milieus of European Islam don't seem to oppose such a research procedure. It's no longer it's not controversial or not strongly opposed. On the other hand, it would be, of course, a blatant
What happened? We have some.
Des soucis.
No, it's okay. I think it's okay. So. It is unstable here. Eva,
I think it's back.
Okay. So.
Yeah, so there's this reflection that engages the Cartesian category of reason. Yes, we reached this point, yes? As one of the foundations of the modernity, and it gives it a new flexibility through the French-Arabic imperfect overlapping translation between raison and aql. Both terms mean reason, but at the same time, these are two sides of the reason, with two strands of tradition behind. So the juxtaposition produces a third novel dimension to the understanding of the modernity, to the understanding of rationalism. This is perhaps the moment to return to Laroui, the uncle that I have already mentioned, the author of such crucial and symptomatic books as Islam et Modernité, justement, in 1987. It is through this kind of reflection that there is a final breakthrough in the essentialist, atemporal, and unchanging vision of the Arabité, according to the immortal expression of Driss Raïbi in the novel Le Bouc, que je dois citer. Voilà l'arabe, le seul, le vrai, the quintessential version of this Arabité. But it's no longer valid for the contemporary writers like Laroui, the nephew. So this Abdallah Laroui, the uncle, was one of the thinkers shaping the modern awareness of the Arabs that transcends the initial confrontation with the West as the eternal other, partially also rewriting the vision issued from Edward Said's very famous work, Orientalism, who gave, Said gave a perfect captation of this European vision of the Oriental as essentially impulsive, essentially unreasonable, which is still present in this ironic portrait of Fauzi in L'Insoumise de la Porte de Flandre, This Fauzi who chops with knife from the butcher's shop is still this unreasonable Oriental, which is a figure of black humor, which is a figure satirized. Is no longer something taken seriously. So we have this kind of passage from something that was a novel conclusion for Said in the 70s to something that is just for laughter. So I speak of all this background that belongs rather to the history of ideas than to the literary history in the narrow sense, to sketch the context in which the contemporary Euro-Mediterranean literature is inscribed. As we saw with this example of Laroui's novel, this literature promptly responds to new tendencies and changes of climate. To maintain its efficiency at transgressing the cultural frontiers and the zones of a so-called clash of civilization, the famous expression of Samuel Huntington, it must adapt itself to the distribution of the roles. It exists actually in our cultural context, in the discourses we hear on the television, etc. This Euro-Mediterranean literature must engage the stereotype and start the battle with it, in which irony, sarcasm, and black humor are often very powerful arms. On the other hand, the necessity of adapting to the existing intellectual legacies, such as this appreciation of Sufism, also explains why the mystical Islam constantly comes to the fore, appearing more frequently than just the plain Sunni orthodoxy, which is perhaps rather the object of criticism in its shallow ritualism and its faultlessness of automatically performed prayers and so on. Not a positively seen legacy for the general landscape of this Euro-Mediterranean literature. But such writers as Fouad Laroui build upon the foundations that are not truly literary, but belonging to the history of ideas and the essential translatability of concepts that was originally established not through literature, but rather through philosophical reflection and comparative religious studies, including this legacy of Philosophia Perennis, which is very still object of deconstruction and criticism. For example, in a recent book of Gregory Lipton on Ibn Arabi, that actually deconstructs the vision of Ibn Arabi created by Philosophia Perennis. So it's a book published 2 years ago. So the importance of Euro-Mediterranean literature consists precisely in revalorizing the legacies and bringing forgotten heritage back into life. Certain distortions and misplaced accents are the price to pay for if this new creative outcome is to be born. Be that as it may, the presence of Islamic legacies is enacting transformative power in the symbolic world that we inhabit as Europeans, both European Muslims and non-Muslims. As the writers such as Fouad Laroui, Abdelwahab Medeb, or even Juan Goytisolo reconsider the Islamic heritage, inverting the position of its center and margins in such a way that the central elements are marginalized and the margin become the transformative core. The dominant Sunni points of view lose their interest and importance. The Quran as a major textual source loses its exclusive place as this untouchable word of God and recovers its historical inscription and its own philological history. Also, it often gives place to extra-Quranic sources of revelation, such as the so-called Hadith Qudsi, which is also the word of God, yet directed to an individual rather than to a community. Sufism as an unorthodox, individualistic, non-normalized, transgressive search for God appears in the limelight. In such a way, the Euro-Mediterranean literature established a transformative, revalorizing, liberating venture that questions not only the Islamic status quo, but also the interstices and incongruities of European modernities of the times after the Nietzschean death of God. In this way, I come to my major interrogation that concerns the metamorphosis of mysticism into a new kind of quest, transgressing and disrupting the cultural frontiers in search of individual freedom, authenticity, spiritual development, just as the story of Fati in Laroui's novel exemplifies. What was originally the search of the divine beyond the frontiers of human rituals and theological systems unable to explain the essence of God, becomes a quest in which secular values such as freedom and authenticity appear as the central stake. So it is no longer or not only about God, it is also about us as individuals and our spiritual development, our becoming persons, the cultural frontiers beyond the cultural obligations imposed upon us. As a result, a peculiar, enriching form of essentially trans-denominational spirituality emerges as a novel legacy issued from the past that appears as distant and often essentially alien to our European identities. What is worth putting in the limelight is the pre-modern, post-modern continuity of the European literature, of the Euro-Mediterranean literature, at least this continuity that it constantly strives to establish. Fatima, there are many other examples that I do not have time to develop. Fatima Mernissi used the 14th century legacy of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya in his Rawdat al-Muhibbin to heal the modern crisis of eroticism. Abdel Wahab Meddeb brought his Sufi terminology of spiritual progress to try to heal the modern concept of revolution in his Printemps de Tunis. Those texts, of which I cannot speak in detail at the present time, feel the cracks and fissures of the modern projects in its crucial aspects, such as political, bodily, sexual liberation. What is more, the stake is to give a continuity to individualistic struggle against the limitations inherent to cultural condition of man. Human inscription in culture, contemplated both in its positive aspect as a repository of transmitted values, and also in the negative aspect as a source of oppression. Cultural oppression is universally exerted through constant invitation to repetition, ready-made patterns of thinking and behavior, ritualistic and literalist formulae of spirituality. This is why the mystical legacy may be something of enormous importance for the present day life and our present day development. It may be transformed into a project that is not only completes but utterly transcends modernity. This is why I claim that Euro-Mediterranean literature should be read exclusively with a focus on shouldn't be read exclusively with a focus on contemporary phenomena such as globalization, the solution of social links caused by migrations. It should be put in a larger perspective of intellectual history, not only in retrospective outlook permitting to explain the allusions, but also with a prospective and proactive spirit that fosters the fulfillment and final overcoming of a modernity. I dare say that this kind of writing announces a new period, a new era, which will be radically different from the modern formation. On the other hand, the search for what I called the extra-cultural becoming of man, in which the potential of mystical experience may be contemplated not as something coming from the past, but as a real, still open possibility of human development, remains a transformative power. To use a Hegelian term, the Wahrnehmung of the mystical is open to the advent of a certain kind of post-human that the modernity didn't dare to predict. And here I stop and I give this time for discussion, because already I spoke too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.